talking about Alcoholics Anonymous, the Fellowship of the Spirit. That is a quote that I took from the big book, and I'll be trying to stick as close as possible to the source material from the 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, and the 1976 version of the book called Alcoholics Anonymous, which is nicknamed the Big Book. So I'll be referring to the Big Book and the 12 and 12 as the core textbooks. They actually operationalize the 12-step program. My name is Kenneth Hart, and from the University of Windsor. So we're going to be talking about understanding AA's spiritual path of recovery from alcoholism. And I'll start off with a question for you. Do you think it is a subversive path, this spiritual path? AAs believe that they should listen less to what other people would have them be, say, and do. Instead, they feel they should become what God wants them to be, regardless of what others might think. Using the 12-step path, AAs feel they can outfit themselves to be of maximum value to God and to the people around them. This is AA ideology, as I understand it. I might have misinterpreted a few points as we go along, and if I have made a mistake, please clarify for me. The Big Book suggests that serving the higher good requires that AA stop serving the taskmasters of their inner demons, the shadow self. By demons, I don't mean anything in a Christian demon devil kind of a way. I just mean like a Jungian shadow. And so there is this letting go of these taskmasters. And we'll be talking about these taskmasters. So there's a letting go, and then there's a grasping on, a shift, you'll see. Now the aims of the workshop, hopefully I'll hit some of these bullseyes. First, to describe the planned program of what I'm calling pragmatic spirituality, which is operationalized in the first 164 pages of the AA Big Book. And these pages from AA's Manual for Living, and this is how I think of it, as a manual for living a virtuous life, outline each of the AA 12 spiritual steps. The term Fellowship of the Spirit. Here's a quote from the Big Book. "We shall be with you in the fellowship of the Spirit, and you will surely meet some of us as you trudge the road to happy destiny." These are all capitalized in the original. This is page 164 from the BB, that's the Big Book, and these are capitalized here. And trudging is methodical without giving up. Think of someone trudging through 3 feet of snow. Lots of resolve and determination, and they are bound to make progress. Here's a picture I took off the internet of Dr. Bob and Bill W. Dr. Bob, these are the co-founders of AA, lived in Akron. He was a medical doctor, more precisely a proctologist, a drunken proctologist. You'll often hear AAs cracking jokes about what it must have been like just before he got into recovery. This is Bill W. Some people say he was a stockbroker, but I think that's a little bit of an embellishment. But he was working on stocks and bonds. And we're going to be passing on Bill and Dr. Bob's message. They often talk about the message in the 12th step. There's actually the term message. Step 12 describes the outcome of working the first 11 steps. Step 12 is really not a real step. It's just a consequence or an outcome. And here it is. Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, these first 11 steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. So it's this message. What is this message that gets passed around and that I'm going to pass on to you? What message does AA seek to pass? The message I hope to convince you, is a spiritual one. Every man can get well. The only condition is that he trust in God and clean house. This is a phrase that Dr. Bob was very fond of. What's AA all about? Dr. Bob, he'll say, trusting God and cleaning house. So I'm going to try to unpack that in the next 2.5 hours. The AA Big Book is considered a kit of spiritual tools. And these spiritual tools are embodied in each of the 12 steps themselves. This is a phrase that I took from page 95 of the Big Book, the 1976 edition. It has been updated since then. These references are all to the 1976 edition. I don't know if you can see that, but it says here also for professionals, there's the Recovery Dynamics Counselor's Manual. Now, there are all kinds of manuals. Hazelton has developed manuals for their counselors. This Recovery Dynamics Manual, I think, is superior to anything that Hazelton has put out. This was developed by a fellow named Joe McQuaney. Joe, you might know, some of you, is famous for the Joe and Charlie Big Book seminars and Big Book workshops. They travel around the country and to foreign countries, teaching AAs, not counselors, but teaching AAs about recovery program and how it's not about abstinence, how it's about sobriety. We'll talk about the difference between abstinence and sobriety later. But Joe runs a Minnesota model type treatment program in Arkansas. And this is what their counselors use for the inpatients. So this is really the world's best 12-step facilitation. We don't have to do any more NIAAA grants developing new 12-step facilitations. We've got it right here. I doubt that any Ph.D. level graduate students could facilitate this effectively. I think that it really requires someone who is themselves a recovered AA, has a little bit of education, some really good social skills, but that can empathize and develop that therapeutic rapport. For clients, Joe McQuaney has written the steps we took, and this is for the actual clients themselves. So if you're working with a client, this is what you would want to give. So we have one for the professional, and we have one for the client, the steps we took. There's also another one that he has just published. You can find this one on Amazon.com, but he has published one for sponsorship. The problem with most sponsorship in AA, as I see it, is that the sponsors don't do what they used to do in the 1930s and 40s, which was take the new AA members through the 12 steps, take them by the hand and take them, do a fourth step, fifth step. This new book by Joe McQuaney is for the sponsors, and it shows the sponsors how to take their sponsees through the planned program of recovery so that they don't just go to meetings and drink lots of coffee. That might get you abstinent for a short period of time, probably white-knuckle abstinence, but it's not going to get you really sober. You have to go through the steps according to AA to get sober. So he's trying to make it a little easier for the sponsors. I'm going to talk about authentic AA. I'm using this term because I'm implying that there is something called inauthentic AA. But authentic AA emphasizes spirituality. The planned program of recovery features spiritual growth. By the end of the second half of the session, I think you will be convinced that it does emphasize spiritual growth. So this planned program of recovery, this PPR, is the 12 steps, as described in Chapter 5 of the Big Book, which is entitled How It Works, How AA Works. It is my sincere hope that people who are developing AA involvement instruments for research will go to Chapter 5 and develop items to assess high-fidelity assessment of how it works. Lots of grant research on trying to figure out the mechanisms and how and why it works. Well, it's been operationalized by non-professional researchers, and so our job now is to try and reproduce using psychometric sound instruments. There are a number of them out there now. I think there's 6 or 7 scales out there. The Brown-Peterson, I think, was one of the earlier ones. Now, originally the purpose of the fellowship was to support the planned program of recovery. So the sponsors would take the sponsees through the 12 steps. A lot of sponsors don't do that anymore. So there is a watering down or a meandering away from the original intent. So in contemporary AA, there often is a disconnect between the fellowship component on the one side and the planned program of recovery operationalized in the first 164 pages of the big book. Back in the 30s and the 40s, those two were the same. So there is a secular branch of AA, and there is a spiritual branch of AA. These people are seeking sobriety, conscious contact with the God of their understanding. These people are not. They're just struggling to not drink, to remain abstinent, possibly using social support, human power, but certainly not any spiritual power. Now there are actually, most of these meetings are documented. If you go to Intergroup and ask for a list, they'll tell you all the meetings in town. But what's happening now, because of this schism, a lot of spiritual seeker AAs are developing these hidden meetings. They're not in AA Intergroup lists. So these are usually big book meetings. But that would be the high-fidelity AA groups. Being an AA member may not mean that one is in recovery. The assumption is often made that if you show up at a meeting, you're in recovery. Now the research is differentiating between attendance at AA meetings and active participation, internalization, AA achievement, embodying the beliefs and the practices. But just being a member may not mean that you're in recovery. So not all members of AA are in recovery. Only the members who seek sobriety and not just abstinence are considered to be in recovery according to AA literature. So how does this work? Sobriety, according to AA, my understanding of AA, is only achieved by adherence to the planned program of recovery described in the AA steps, these 12 steps that are taught to inpatients using this recovery dynamics, and this book called The Steps We Took. Each chapter is on a different step. Counterfeit AA, earlier I used the term authentic AA, now I'm using the term counterfeit AA, consists of members who attend meetings for the sole purpose of physical abstinence. People go to meetings for a lot of reasons, and some people go to meetings not because they want to become abstinent. They're lonely, they have no intentions of being abstinent, and they just want to alleviate themselves from their loneliness so they can socialize with other people. Maybe eventually they might get bitten by the recovery bug and get serious, but also you have people going to meetings to socialize. There's something called 13th stepping, where you have unscrupulous people using it as a dating service. So there are a number of motives, and physical abstinence is a popular motive, and sobriety is, I think, a less popular motive. I think proportion-wise, I'm not familiar with any research that's done this, but but I think probably there's more people interested in just abstinence, not changing and growing along spiritual lines, than sobriety. But research is looking at this now. Sobriety is spiritual, according to AA's understanding. Authentic AA is spiritual. Its goal is sobriety and not just abstinence. Sobriety is flourishing in all domains of life: the mind, body, and spirit. And the mind includes things like cognition, cognitive activity, information processing, emotions, and motives. And we'll talk a lot about motives later on, which is where AA thinks the action is. And a lot of these motives are actually hidden to awareness originally, and it takes going through the steps to uncover these hidden motives that have been really corrupting and eroding one's life. Sobriety is not drinking and then some. Sobriety is not drinking and also being able to sustain optimal quality of life. You're seeing more and more empirical papers coming out now in scholarly literature looking at sobriety and differentiating it from abstinence. The way I would describe it is abstinence, not drinking, plus a sustainable, optimal quality of life. As we go through, you'll see this is very reminiscent to the Seligman's Meaningful Life. If you're following all of the developments in positive psychology about living a pleasant life and the good life and then the meaningful life, you'll see that there's a lot of overlap between Seligman's idea that the person who is living the optimal life, the optimal quality of life, are using their signature strengths for a cause or a purpose that is greater than them. Derive tremendous amount of satisfaction and gratification. And it's not just selfish benefit, they are benefiting others and society. And this is actually what 12 Steps seeks for its members. People who are sober feel they are on the broad highway, walking hand in hand with the spirit of the universe. This is the broad highway right here. Though I don't think there's many 3-year-olds going to AA meetings. I know there's Alateen, but I don't, never. There are a whole bunch of interesting terms: capitalized broad highway, capitalized spirit of the universe. Bill in the early AAs used a number of terms to denote deity and spirituality. We'll go through some of these terms very shortly. The use of spiritual terms in the AA Big Book. I have actually a concordance, an AA concordance. It's about this thick, and it's got tiny print, smaller than a smallest phone book. And this was a labor of love by a now deceased AA. And there are just a limited number of them, but this is cross-indexed, and I don't know if he even had a computer when he did it, but if anybody wants to look at it, I can show it to you. 1976 third edition is the one that I looked up in the concordance. I looked up the term spiritual in the concordance, and it was used 150 times. Just imagine looking them up if you had to do it manually. The term God is used 277 times. This is not just in the first 164 pages, but this includes the stories in the back too. The term creator is used 12 times. The term higher power is used 18 times. Now, there is liberal use of other terms for transcendent divine being. Capitalized, he, him, his, himself, 107 times, referring to male conception of God. Of course, AA invites members to think of God in any way you like. And that, I think if you have problems with a male conception, then that's fine. Use a different understanding. 107 times. Other terms used in the Big Book include Father of Light, which is interesting, another masculine, Spirit of the Universe, we saw that, creative intelligence, but there are a number of terms like this. You saw the broad highway, you saw the fellowship of the Spirit with a capital F. Later on in the presentation, after the big break, there'll be a lot of verbatim quotes from the Big Book so that we can stay as close to the source literature. But here, it says in the Big Book, page 46, as soon as we admitted the possible existence of a creative intelligence, a spirit of the universe underlying the totality of things, we began to be possessed of a new sense of power and direction, provided we took other simple steps. That's provided that the person methodically goes through all 12 of the steps in the order in which they are appear, with a sponsor who has themselves gone through the steps. They say it's a simple steps. I don't think it's that simple. I guess it is simple in one regard, but people balk at doing it. So the trick is to get the clients willing. So that's why it's not simple. Some of us have taken very hard knocks to learn this truth, ... And what is this truth? We simply do not stop drinking so long as we place dependence upon other people ahead of dependence on God. And that's really what AA 12 Steps seeks to do, is to shift this priority, to somehow shift people so that they will depend or trust on God. They'll be more apt to do that than on people. So you're starting with this stance and you're trying to shift to the other stance. So these are quotes. Again, this is from page 98 of the Big Book. According to the Big Book, the aim of AA is to help recovering alcoholics do what? To keep in fit spiritual condition. I plucked this off of page 85. What's another aim? A fourth aim is to help recovering alcoholics to live by spiritual principles. We'll talk about what these principles are later on. Honesty is chief amongst them. Being truthful, being a lover of the truth, not lying, cheating, misrepresenting the truth. And that's hard to do in our society. But there are a number of principles. Another aim of AA, I have this, and I could send it to you as a PowerPoint if you want it. You just email me. I have my email here at the end, and I can send it to you when you get back to your computer. To walk day by day in the path of spiritual progress. This path, this broad highway, Bill, I guess, liked a lot of these visual trudging movement metaphors. And to grow along spiritual lines. As we go through, I'm going to unpack what actually it means to grow along spiritual lines. It's a very nebulous, abstract concept. So here's a summary. AA's 12 steps are steps. You can think of them as steps on a spiritual quest. And as you go up these steps, you become, quote unquote, enlightened. It is this vertical, transcendent journey to sobriety, up. But here you have someone going down. So when you become spiritually flabby, and you lose your spiritual fitness and you stop adhering to the planned program of recovery, the big book predicts that you will relapse and go back toward alcoholism. And it's much more than just drinking excessively, uncontrollably. There's a number of character defects that relapse. The dishonesty relapses. The self-seeking, the inconsideration of others, the lack of courage. They talk about lack of courage or being cowardly as one of the major character flaws. So alcoholism is more than just drinking to excess and uncontrollably. Brief history of the 12 steps, really quick. The contemporary 12 steps represent a slight revision of a set of 6 directions followed by the first 100. Actually, not all of the first 100. The early members of AA in the late 1930s, wasn't even all 100. It was just a few that used this 6-step program. And these 6 steps were based on Oxford Group tenets. The Oxford Group was an evangelical organization that promoted first-century Christianity. And it was very popular in the UK and the USA in the 20s and 30s. I'll say a little bit more on a few other slides. The leader was Reverend Frank Buckman, who was a Lutheran minister, and the Oxford Group was a forerunner of moral rearmament movement. So it did metamorphosize. Now the goals of the Oxford Group, you'll see that there's a lot of parallel between the goals of AA and the goals of the Oxford Group. To help members get right with God. Well, AA, you'll find, I have a slide at the end saying, it's about getting right with God, getting right with yourself, and getting right with other people. Those are the 3 domains of sobriety. So I think Bill got some of this right here. To help members give up personal control of their life and permit God to be in control. They call this conversion process soul surgery, which is an interesting metaphor, soul surgery. The Oxford Group promoted 4 absolute standards for living a virtuous life. The 4 ideals provide a moral compass to keep spiritual seeker on track with God's will. And you'll see that this is also true in the big book, especially in the 10th step, where the AA is asked on a daily basis, in the morning, before leaving the house, during the day, and at night there is a nightly review, to always take a read on the moral compass. 10th step is really a brief, online, ongoing recapitulation of steps 1 through 9. And there's a lot of moral compass watching and determining whether you have deviated. So contemporary AA steps incorporate these 4 ideals. What are these ideals? They call them the 4 absolutes of the Oxford Group. Absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, and absolute love. Love meaning agape love, or love for humanity, for mankind, for humankind. Altruism. There's a 5-point process for soul surgery. This is Reverend Buckman here. First, if you are a member of the Oxford Group, you are asked to share your sins and temptations in a group context. The group context consisted of what they call house parties. They didn't have AA back then, but they had AA-like meetings, and they were at people's homes. And they called them house parties. They would use this sharing as a witness to others so that they too might recognize and share their sins. And sin, my understanding, is just a deviation from those four absolutes. When you are deviating from honesty. Of course, different people have different ideas of what sin is, but so the third of the 5-point process, surrender all of one's life to God. So to surrender one's past, one's present, and one's future into God's keeping and God's direction, trusting that God will not harm you and that God will not point you in the wrong direction. In fact, this is a major stumbling block in AA, as we'll see when we get to it, is that many newcomers don't believe that God will point them in the right direction. Well, first, they don't believe that he'll pay attention at all, or she or it, and then trust is a problem. We'll come to this later. Soul surgery, number 4. Make restitution to other people who have been directly or indirectly wronged by one's sins. So you can see here the social concern. And this is nothing other than steps 8 and 9 in AA. And 5th, listen for, accept, and rely on God's guidance, carrying out his wishes in all of one's words and deeds. A little bit of a typo. Listen to, accept. Of course, this is just the 11th step, as you see it in AA. Bill has changed the words, made it a little bit more palatable to neophyte AAs. So we see a little bit about the genesis of AA's 12 steps. Here's a picture of Bill W. There's lots of movies out there. If you go to Blockbusters, you might be able to get some movies. And I'm trying to remember who was the actor in that movie. Does anybody see that movie? Yeah, he's on Shark, that new series coming out yet. So I think that was a pretty good Hollywood rendition. Bill W. took aspects of soul surgery from the Oxford group and initially developed a 6-step program, which was used in early AA meetings in New York and Akron. Bill was in New York, and Dr. Bob was in Akron. He didn't actually call them steps at that time. Bill called them 6 chunks of truth. What are these chunks of truth? Alcoholics, Bill thought, need to admit that we are licked, that we were powerless over alcohol. So that's just the first step as we see it today. We made a moral inventory of our defects or sins, and this is the 4th step as we know it today. We confessed or shared our shortcomings with another person in confidence. That would be a 5th step. You would do that with your sponsor, or you would do it with a clergy person. I don't think it's possible to get sober without a sponsor, because you work as a team with the sponsor. So chunk number 4, we made restitution to all those we had harmed by our drinking. Number 5, we tried to help other alcoholics with no thought of reward or money or prestige. This you will see in the 12th step, but in the 12th step it is done automatically because it is part of the spiritual awakening. It's not something that people have to think about or force themselves to do. And we prayed to whatever God we thought there was for power to practice these precepts. And you'll see this over and over again as we go through each of the 12 steps, always relying on God for courage and for the power. So these are these 6 chunks of truth, and Bill modified them into 12 steps. And according to AA literature, it took him a whole 20 minutes to revise these 6 into the 12. I'm assuming that's what he did when he wrote the 12 steps, is he had already the 6. So step 1 is understanding the problem. We'll be going through this again and again and again in different ways. Step 2, understanding the solution. Step 3, deciding to seek the solution. And step 3 is just a behavioral intention. It is an intention. It is a decision. There is no action. It is strictly cognitive or motivational. Steps 4 through 11 are the action steps, taking action to implement the solution. And so here we're talking about enacted AA behaviors and internalized AA beliefs. These are enacted and internalized as the AA goes through the steps under the guidance of a sponsor. Or if they're an inpatient in Arkansas, they would get Joe McQuaney or one of his counselors using this recovery dynamics manual. But that's done in a group. This is not individual counseling. That's for groups. And step 12 is not really a step. It's an outcome of taking the prior actions. And my understanding of the 12th step is that this is simply living a meaningful life, also known as a virtuous living. The helping that is done and the passing on of the message is just part and parcel of the spiritual awakening. The person just does it because they are compelled to do it. It's like a flower, it just blossoms. It doesn't try to blossom, it just blossoms. All right, step 1. So what is the nature of the problem? I'm going to go through the steps twice. We're going to go through them slightly differently. I'm going to give the first pass through is going to be a little bit more psychological. There'll be a little bit of spiritual jargon in there, and I will be paraphrasing my understanding of the core literature. The second time we go through the 12 steps, after the break, we're going to have a little 5-minute break in just half a minute now. I'm going to stop now for half a minute. But after the break, we're going to go through these 12 steps again, and I'm going to be using the source material. I'll be giving you verbatim quotes that I have selected that I thought illustrate the spiritual themes underlying step 1, the spiritual themes underlying step 2. So those verbatim quotes I'm going to save for after the second half of the workshop. So we're going to go through the steps twice, and going at it from different angles using different kind of vocabulary. All right. So if we want to just take a couple of minutes now, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, if anybody needs to take a break. If you want to look at these recovery dynamics manual, I'll keep the recovery dynamics therapist manual up here, and I'll keep the steps we took book up here as well. Also, I just noticed on the inside here, I have Joe McQuaney's latest book. It's called Carry This Message, a guide for a big book sponsorship. Carry this message. Carry this message. That's the message that we talked about. This is a guide for big book sponsorship. And that's really, somebody needs to do a study on qualitative differences in sponsors, those who do big book sponsorship and those who don't do big book sponsorship. All right, welcome back. Last time, we'll take another break in half an hour from now, and then that'll be the morning, the first half of the session. We can take another break at that time, and then we'll come back and finish off with 2 40-minute sessions for the second half. My hope was to have done 2 40 minutes in the first half and then 2 40 minutes in the second half, and it's approximating that. So last time I was saying that my plan was to take you through the steps twice. And so let's start off with the first pass through step 1. And step 1 asks, the recovering AA is asked to get an understanding of what the nature of their problem is. So if your car is broke down, then you need to diagnose the nature of the problem, because the repair will match the nature of the problem. So in contemporary AA, step 1 reads, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. You will see here that there's 2 parts. Part 1 is admitting that we were powerless, and part 2, that our lives had become unmanageable. They are slightly different. And it's not just because of excess drinking that the lives are unmanageable. There are root characterological problems that give rise to both the alcohol abuse and the unmanageability of the life. And we'll talk about these root causes. Step 1 specifies the exact nature of the problem. This word, exact nature, comes up again and again. It's actually in one of the steps where they talk about the exact nature of the wrongs. So that's an important term. The BB, the big book, suggests the main problem resides in the mind, not the body. Certainly there is an acknowledgement that there is a biological contribution, which they call an allergy, which they're using as a metaphor for how the body responds abnormally after alcohol is ingested. But according to the big book, the main problem resides in the mind, not in the body. There's not much you can do about the allergy, although I think now they have new drugs that you might be able to take now, Trexone or other drugs. But the main problem, according to AA's understanding, is something called the mental obsession. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about this mental obsession. This is a tenacious, false belief that the euphoric sense of well-being felt during the honeymoon phase of drinking can be recaptured. I'm sort of thinking about, I do some gambling research about gamblers who have won big, and then they try to chase and get that thrill back. So the main problem is the mental obsession. So let's unpack AA's mental obsession. The obsession also refers to a tenacious false belief that one can drink safely and in moderation. So there's 2 aspects to the obsession. And this is the thinking that you can drink like a gentleman, as you will hear at some AA meetings. Belief in the efficacy and the safety of alcohol perseveres over time despite repeated evidence to the contrary. Year in and year out, there is empirical evidence that one cannot drink safely and one cannot recapture that honeymoon sense of well-being in the early days. But the mental obsession is an obsession. It perseveres. Belief perseverance. So the mental obsession is thought, according to AA, to block out contrary beliefs. The mental obsession is thought to override the ability to see the truth. AA talks a lot about truth and being honest. Interferes with sound thinking. You'll see in step 2, they use the word insanity in one of the steps. And I just want to flag that to you because their understanding of it is different than a mental health professional's understanding or in the criminal justice system. We're talking about interfering with sound thinking. The mental obsession enables the alcoholic belief that one is not powerless over alcohol consumption. So the mental obsession serves a number of different functions. Really prevents recovery. The mental obsession refers to the insanity aspect of step 2, and I'm going to suggest that AA suggests that this is all about wrong thinking, the insanity. It's not legal or psychiatric insanity. I think Bill coined the phrase in 1938 or 37. So AA's mental obsession, a little bit more. Step 1 involves recognizing that insanity manifests during sobriety at the exact time when the decision is made to consume alcohol. The decision is thought to be insane. An alcoholic is sober at some point during their life, and they decide to take a drink. AA's understanding is that decision is made when a person is sober, and they would consider that to be insane. That is not right thinking. We're going to unpack this as we go along. So insanity is not the dumb things and the ridiculous things that people do after they have blood alcohol levels over 0.08 and they are inebriated. That is not AA's understanding of the term insanity. It is extremely faulty, flawed thinking that goes into the decision that one can drink safely this time. It's going to be different than it has been for the last 500 times. So the decision to drink is thought to be insane or irrational, given the knowledge that one is, quote-unquote, allergic. Now, this term allergic refers to the body. AA does acknowledge that there is a strong biological component, that once alcohol is into the system, it is very difficult to inhibit continued drinking. There's something going on, according to AA's understanding, which they developed in the late 1930s and 40s. Obviously, medicine has advanced since then, but they do talk about enzymes and biological processes. They call this the allergy. It's an abnormal reaction of the body to ingesting alcohol, which causes the person to be unable to stop once they start. So it's a metaphor. If you were allergic to strawberries and you had an abnormal reaction, this would be the metaphor. If you nearly died or you ended up getting thrown in jail or you lost your driver's license every time you ate strawberries, you would eventually stop eating strawberries. The thought would come, I should eat strawberries, and you would make a decision not to eat strawberries. The insanity here is these people are just as allergic to alcohol as somebody would be to nuts. You know, they eat peanuts and then they die. Well, these people have almost died repeatedly and got into all kinds of horrible difficulties, but they still will decide that it's safe to drink. So this is the insanity. The AA at step 1, we're still at step 1, comes to believe that stinking thinking, which is one of their terms, before taking the first drink is the problem. This is the mental obsession. That stinking thinking before taking the first drink is the problem. Step 1 also involves accepting one is helpless to change his or her stinking thinking concerning alcohol's efficacy or safety. It's going to give me that sense of well-being that it used to, and that I'll be able to drink in moderation and it won't get out of control this time. So step 1 involves accepting that one is helpless to change the stinking thinking. Step 1, acceptance of personal powerlessness. I found this on the internet And I thought it was interesting, if you look at the shape of the hands here, they're in a heart. I don't know if that was planned, but I read some meaning into it. I can share it with you later, if you like. In step 1, the alcoholic suffers due to loss of hope and despair, if they're doing it right. This is what you, as a sponsor or a treatment provider, want to happen in your client at step 1. You want the client to suffer due to them having lost hope and them despairing. The alcoholics are hopeless and despairing because they can't resolve their mental obsession or their physical allergy. The mental obsession is which compels them to pick up that first drink, even though they're sober, knowing that if they pick up that first drink, the physical allergy is going to kick in and their body's going to react abnormally and cause them to crave, and they're not going to be able to stop themselves from drinking to excess once they start. So they are helpless to stop starting, and they are helpless to stop after they start. So the hopelessness comes from a double awareness, according to my understanding of AA literature. So what is this double awareness? First, it's futile to attempt drinking in moderation, accepting that it's futile to attempt drinking in moderation. And the second awareness is that one is condemned to be victimized for life by the malevolent influence of uncontrollable consumption of alcohol. That is where I think AA says the hopelessness comes from. So AA is all about saying, "Uncle, I give up." And here we have a shift. Originally, before step 1, there is a step 0, 20 years, 30 years of suffering due to untreated alcoholism. And it's that shift from step 0 to step 1. That's where step 0 is the no surrender. And then the white flag, once you pick up that white flag, you've made that transition and you have worked the first step. You have said, "Uncle, I give up." And if you want to use a wrestling match metaphor, in the wrestling match, to keep alcohol under control, step 1 marks a shift from not surrendering to admitting defeat. Your opponent has you licked, as Bill said. So at step 1, the AA gives up hope that self-will has the ability to control one's drinking. They convince themselves that they can't. This is thought by AA to be an honest and truthful admission that alcohol is more powerful than the exercise of free will. I'm calling this is not a term that AA uses, this is a term that I made up, divine despair and creative hopelessness. I think these things exist. Divine despair and creative hopelessness facilitate increased motivation to try a new solution. And certainly AA does suggest that doing step 1 makes AAs ready for step 2. Step 2 will be completely ineffective unless step 1 is done. According to AA, it's the only one that you have to do 100%. So they really emphasize the first step. According to AA, they say the only step that you have to do 100% is the first step. We'll unpack this as we go through, but they do emphasize that's really important. Oftentimes what happens is a step is actually done before the person makes their first AA meeting, because that's what has driven them to the meeting, is because they've reached the end of their tether and they have no other options. Nobody gets up in the morning and says, "This is a fine day to go to AA." No. They are despairing when they walk in there, and they have hope that maybe you can help me because I've lost all hope that I can help me. So let's move on to step 2. Step 1 It's like a chain. All 11 are in a chain, and one links into 2. So what is the nature of the solution to the problem? So this is step 2. Asks the AA to understand the nature of the solution to the problem. So step 2. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Again, there's that word, sanity, and it's just right thinking. Step 2 presupposes one is willing or motivated to seek a solution to one's state of helplessness vis-a-vis consumption of alcohol. This presupposition comes from the belief that people will work the first step before moving on to the second step. Most people won't attempt the second step unless they're backed into a corner. Who was it that said that people find their way to heaven by backing away from hell? That's sort of what the first and second step are like. People are driven to the second step. Step 2 is a shift in thinking that takes time, and I'm just emphasizing the process. The word came to believe. It is a process that unfolds over time. Believing a solution to one's helplessness exists. This is what I think the belief is. The third word, belief, I think, is believing that a solution to one's helplessness exists. Turns out that this is a spiritual solution and believing that this solution can only be found by developing a partnership or relationship with an all-powerful spiritual source of power. This is what AA would have the new member believe. Maybe not the first couple of meetings, but eventually. And those people who are never able to work the second step may continue to go to AA meetings, but they are not trying to grow along spiritual lines. And I would argue that they are not adhering to the planned program of recovery. They are a member of what I would call inauthentic AA, or secular AA. By the way, there's a lot of people, well, not a lot, there are a number of people who really have no business going to AA meetings. They're not bona fide alcoholics. They might be heavy drinkers, they might be drug addicts, but there are a number of people who are not bona fide alcoholics that are going to AA meetings, and they are mismatched. So step 1 is a prerequisite to step 2. If you want to do an effective step 2, you need to have done an effective step 1. Big Book suggests AAs need to be made ready for step 2 by first working a good, quote-unquote, first step. If a person still believes secretly that they could drink in moderation, they have not worked the first step, and they are ill-suited to go to step 2. They probably wouldn't go to step 2 because they don't need God's help, because their life is not unmanageable. They don't have the problem that needs a divine solution. AA literature suggests very few alcoholics will take step 2 seriously if part of them still believes that they can drink in moderation. So the one sort of propels the other, catapults the other. If an AA is less than 100% convinced that they are a bona fide alcoholic, this will undermine their motivation to attempt step 2. And if their goal is not to abstain, but if their goal is to moderate their drinking and learn to cut back a little, they are ill-suited to continue on the 12 steps. They are stuck at step 1 until they work it. They either are going to leave AA or they're not going to get sober. They might possibly become abstinent, but they're not even trying to be abstinent. They're trying to be... There are a number of people who go to AA with the intent of learning how to control their drinking, and they are poorly matched. And they probably drop out fairly shortly. Step 2. So coming to believe that some sort of a supreme being exists, A, and that it could be, but need not be called God. Coming to acquire a conception of this higher power, whatever the label given, that sees the higher power as both immanent and transcendent. I think this is emphasized again and again in the AA literature, that this higher power is available in the world. It is immanent, but it is also transcendent. So this is a different kind of a conception of a higher power. But you will see it again and again as we go through the quotes at the second half of the talk. You'll see this is a special kind of a higher power. So coming to believe that this higher power, HP, is available, coming to believe that this higher power is able and willing to resolve one's intractable predicament. This is what is asked of the AA at step 2. If anybody's doing research and they're involved in scholarship, these are the kinds of questions that might want to be designed on a survey. What we have now is research studies that have asked participants, here's a list with 12 check boxes, one for step 1, one for step 2, one for step 3, and people are asked to check, yes, no, I have done step 2, yes, no. These are so full of error, these measurements, that they are, I would probably be like me taking this glass, putting it up to my ear, and then going up to the wall over there and trying to see what's going on in there and figure it out. I mean, it's just a poor indicator. These kinds of items. Higher power is seen as a solution to the admitted problem of personal powerlessness over the mental obsession that drinking alcohol is effective and safe. These people are obsessed with the idea that drinking alcohol is effective and safe. They can drink in moderation. All right, we'll take a little intermission, then we're going to have another intermission. It's my... What do we have here? Oh, roadside funnies. I don't know how funny any of this is. This is a real place. Somebody should tell them. It's on the way to Terre Haute, maybe. This is a sign providing evidence that hell can indeed freeze over. Anybody know where this is? It's in Michigan. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know, it's around Lansing, or I don't know. It's in Michigan. It's a BMW owned by a dumb man. Blonde, upside down. They did that intentionally. A real legitimate sign, too. Oh. You can get 10 pounds of marijuana for $1.49 at this IGA. That's a bargain. This brings us to step 3. And step 3, the AA is asked to resolve to pursue the proposed solution. Okay? Step 1, they identified the problem. Step 2, they've identified a solution, and now they have a choice. They want to stay with the problem and live with it, or do they want to pursue the solution? Are they going to go back, or are they going to go forward? And so step 3 is developing resolve to pursue the proposed solution. And all it is about resolve. This is a motivational step where they try to become more willing or ready. So it reads as follows. Step 3, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over the care of God as we understood Him. These are in italics in all the AA literature to emphasize the importance of as we understood Him. So you can get rid of the word God. If that objects you, new AAs are asked to get a black magic marker and then just get rid of all of every time you see that word. And if you're a feminist who's offended by the use of the him, get rid of all those, and then it'll be your job to put something else in there. Eventually, you'll be able to put something in there that works for you. In fact, that's not a bad idea. They could start printing big books that are just blank, so that people can just... All right. Step 3 presupposes that all action is born out of a decision to act. Whether the decision is more or less available to conscious awareness is some debate. People might argue that there are unconscious decisions and conscious decisions. But this is the presupposition made in step 3 because, we're going to be talking here about a decision and choice. And there is free will involved in making a decision. Step 3, the internalization of steps 1 and 2 should propel the AA to affirm the third step decision. If in fact the AA has done a good first step, and if in fact the AA has done a good second step, they can't help but not work the third step. They are interlinked in such a way that it is a cascading domino effect, if it's done properly. And the way you do it properly is outlined in the first 164 pages of the big book, and there's some other instruction in the 12 and 12 steps and 12 traditions. Step 3 is an intention. Step 3 is an intention to stop relying on oneself as a solution to ... It's an intention to stop relying on oneself. You can't start relying on God until you stop relying on yourself as a solution. So there's really a coin with two sides on this. An intention to stop relying on oneself as a solution to one's inability to drink in moderation. Intention to stop relying on oneself as a solution to one's inability to live a satisfying and fulfilled life. This is the first half of step 1, and this is the second half of step 1. I mentioned earlier that there are two halves to step 1. And the second half of step 1 is the admission that one is unable to live a satisfying and fulfilled life. One's life is unmanageable. But that is independent of the consequences of drunkenness and being inebriated. Certainly there are all kinds of adverse life consequences that will flow from drunken driving, etc., etc. That's part of the unmanageability, but AA's understanding of the unmanageability is much broader than just alcohol-related unmanageability. These character flaws that give rise to the drinking, also these same underlying character flaws are thought to give rise to an inability to lead a meaningful, satisfying life that has a sense of authenticity. So step 3 marks an intention to give up playing the role of director of one's recovery. The big book uses the metaphor of a theatrical play where there are actors and there is a director, with the bullhorn. And so the AA is asked to give up the role of playing the director of one's own recovery. Because that's what they've been trying to do in step 0 for all those years. They've been trying to learn how to drink in moderation unsuccessfully. And step 3 involves agreeing it's a good idea to quit taking advice and direction from one's own self. Later on, we'll see in step 4 that the ego, that the self, has corrupt motives that can't be trusted, that get one in trouble. So the third step decision is agreeing it's a good idea to quit taking advice and direction from one's own self. The direction, the person who's behind the bullhorn directing, ought not to be oneself. If you've done a first step thoroughly, you're pretty well convinced of that. But if you're not convinced of that, you'll be convinced after you go through step 4 and step 5, if you need more convincing. We're going to finish off in the next 2 or 3 minutes, and we're going to be taking a break, and that'll mark the first half of the workshop. It's a 3-hour workshop, and then we'll be coming back and doing the second half of the workshop. But just give me another 2 minutes. Let's just see how far. Yeah, all right. So this will be just 2 minutes. Finishing off on step 3 involves increased resolve to hand over control in life and let God, higher power, be the directing intelligence that guides and empowers one's recovery. Hand over control in life and let God, higher power, be the directing intelligence that guides one's recovery and that powers or is the engine of one's recovery. In AA meetings, you'll often hear people saying, "Turn it over." This is one of the catchphrases or slogans. And that's what turn it over is about. It's handing over control to a higher power that is going to direct, that is a directing intelligence. This surrender to higher power requires one also decide to quit taking direction from one's ego. We call this denial of self. Distrust of the wisdom of the self grows in steps 4 and 5, you'll see after the break, with the recognition that motives serving the human ego can be corrupt, impure, and counterproductive. And that's why the life is unmanageable, the second half of the first step. And so, finally, steps 4 and 5 will teach, and 3 is leading up to 4 and 5. Steps 4 and 5 will teach the AA that decisions of the self or ego are often colored by hidden fears, dishonesty, and inconsideration of the needs and rights of others. And you shouldn't trust for that reason. So why don't we just take a break at this time, and we'll start off at step 4 after the break.